100 Apache warriors don't just appear at your cabin door by accident. They come for blood, for justice, or for war. And Samuel Flint Mackenzie was about to find out which one it was. But let's go back to where it all started, 12 hours earlier. The Colorado wind was howling like a banshee through the mountain passes, carrying with it the kind of cold that cuts straight through to your bones. Flint had seen plenty of harsh winters in his 29 years working cattle in these unforgiving mountains, but something about this particular night felt different. Wrong, even. He was checking on his horses in the barn when he first heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the screaming wind, a soft whimpering, like a wounded animal caught in a trap. But as he listened closer, he realized with growing alarm that it wasn't an animal at all. It was a child. Flint grabbed his lantern and stepped out into the blizzard. The snow was coming down so hard he could barely see 3 feet in front of him, but he followed the sound toward the edge of his property. That's when he found him. A young Apache boy, couldn't be more than 10 years old, huddled against a fallen log. The kid was barely conscious, his lips blue with cold, wearing nothing but thin buckskins that offered no protection against the mountain storm. His small body was shaking so violently that Flint could hear his teeth chattering from 10 feet away. Most ranchers in these parts would have reached for their rifle first and asked questions later. The relationship between settlers and the local Apache bands had been tense for years, with raids and counter-raids keeping everyone on edge, but Flint had always been different. Maybe too different for his own good. He set down his lantern and approached slowly, hands visible. The boy looked up at him with eyes that held more resignation than fear, as if he'd already accepted that this was where his story would end. Flint knelt down beside him, speaking as gently as he could manage. "Easy there, son. I'm not going to hurt you." The boy didn't understand the words, but something in Flint's tone must have reached him because he didn't try to run. Not that he could have. The kid was so weak from cold and exhaustion that he could barely lift his head. Flint thought about his neighbors, about what they'd say if they saw him helping an Apache child. He thought about the warnings he'd heard in town about recent tensions with the tribes. He thought about the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. Then he looked into those desperate, dying eyes again and made the decision that would change everything. Without another word, Flint scooped the boy up in his arms. The child weighed almost nothing and was cold as ice to the touch. As he carried him toward the cabin, Flint could feel the boy's heart beating like a frightened bird against his chest. Inside his modest cabin, Flint set the boy down gently near the fireplace and immediately began stoking the flames higher. The kid was shivering so hard he could barely sit upright, and Flint realized with growing alarm that this was more than just being cold. This was the early stages of freezing to death. He quickly heated water and began preparing warm broth from the rabbit stew he'd made earlier. But as he worked, Flint caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Around the boy's neck, partially hidden by his buckskin shirt, was a distinctive necklace. Intricate silver work and turquoise stones that he'd seen described before. His neighbor, old Tom Crawford, had told him about those exact patterns just last month. They were the ceremonial ornaments worn by the family of Chief Red Sky, the most feared Apache war leader in the territory. Flint's hand froze halfway to handing the boy the warm broth. If this child was who he thought he wasn't just helping a lost kid. He was harboring the son of the man who could bring 100 warriors down on his head without blinking an eye. But it was too late to change course now. The boy was already reaching for the broth with shaking hands, and Flint couldn't bring himself to turn away a dying child, no matter whose son he might be. What Flint didn't know was that 15 miles away, an Apache search party had just found the boy's trail leading directly to his cabin. And Chief Red Sky himself was riding at the head of that party, his face a mask of fury and grief that promised nothing but death for whoever had taken his son. The boy drank the broth slowly, color gradually returning to his cheeks. But as he warmed up, Flint noticed something else that made his stomach drop. The kid's hands were badly frostbitten, and there were signs of a recent injury, a bandaged cut on his arm that looked infected. This wasn't just a child who had wandered off and gotten lost. This was someone who had been through serious trauma, possibly fleeing from something or someone. And now he was in Flint's cabin, drinking his broth, while somewhere out there in the storm, people were probably looking for him. The boy finished the broth and looked up at Flint with something that might have been gratitude. But as the wind continued to howl outside, Flint couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made either the best decision of his life or the last one he'd ever make. The child fell asleep by the fire within an hour, exhaustion finally overtaking his small body. But despite the warmth of the cabin, he was still shivering. Flint looked around and realized he had only one blanket left, his own heavy wool blanket that had kept him warm through countless mountain winters. Without hesitation, he wrapped it around the sleeping boy, tucking it carefully around his small frame. The child's shivering finally stopped, and for the first time since he'd found him, Flint allowed himself to believe the boy might actually survive the night. But as Flint settled down to sleep on the bare floor, wrapped only in his thin coat, he had no idea that his act of kindness was about to be put to the ultimate test. The sound of horses woke him just before dawn, not the casual approach of a neighbor, but the rhythmic thunder of many hooves moving in formation. Flint's eyes snapped open, and he moved quickly to the window, peering out through the early morning mist. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. 100 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, forming a perfect semicircle around his cabin. War paint gleamed in the pale dawn light, and every weapon was pointed directly at his front door. At the center of the formation sat a man who could only be Chief Red Sky, massive, imposing, with silver streaming through his long black hair and eyes that burned with barely contained rage. The boy stirred awake, still wrapped in Flint's blanket. When he saw what was outside the window, his eyes went wide with a mixture of relief and terror. He spoke rapidly in Apache, pointing toward the door and then at himself. Flint understood enough to know the boy was trying to tell him something important, but the language barrier made communication impossible. All he knew for certain was that he had about 30 seconds to figure out how to explain to 100 armed warriors that he'd saved their chief's son, not stolen him. A single voice called out from the formation, speaking in English with a heavy accent but perfect clarity. "White man, we know you have taken something that belongs to us. Send out the boy and perhaps you will live to see another sunset." Flint's mouth went dry. The voice carried absolute authority. This had to be Chief Red Sky himself. Flint had heard stories about the man, how he'd never lost a battle against the cavalry, how he'd united several Apache bands under his leadership. And now Flint was about to face him across the most dangerous conversation of his life. The boy grabbed Flint's arm with surprising strength for someone so small. He pointed to himself, then made a gesture across his throat, shaking his head frantically. He was trying to warn Flint about something, but what? Then it hit him like lightning. The boy wasn't just the chief's son. He was the chief's only son. In Apache culture, that made him invaluable, not just as family, but as the future of the bloodline. If anything had happened to him while in Flint's care, even if it wasn't his fault, Chief Red Sky would have no choice but to make an example that other settlers would never forget. Flint realized with growing horror that saving the boy's life might have been the easy part. Now he had to prove to 100 armed warriors that he'd saved him, not harmed him. And he had about 20 seconds to figure out how to do that before Chief Red Sky lost his patience and turned his cabin into a battlefield. Flint made the hardest decision of his life. He opened the cabin door and stepped outside with his hands raised high, the boy following close behind him, still wrapped in Flint's wool blanket. The sight that greeted him was something straight out of his worst nightmares. 100 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, forming a perfect circle around his property. War paint gleamed in the morning light, and every weapon was pointed directly at him. At the front of the formation sat Chief Red Sky, and Flint could see immediately where the boy had gotten his features. The same strong jaw, the same intelligent eyes, but where the child's face held innocence, the father's was carved from stone and fury. The boy ran toward his father, calling out in Apache, but instead of the joyful reunion Flint expected, Chief Red Sky's expression grew even darker. The chief dismounted and knelt beside his son, examining him carefully while the boy spoke rapidly, gesturing back toward Flint in the cabin. Flint couldn't understand the words, but he could read the chief's body language. Every muscle in Red Sky's frame was coiled like a spring ready to explode into violence. Whatever the boy was telling him, it wasn't making things better. Finally, Chief Red Sky stood and walked toward Flint with slow, deliberate steps. The other warriors remained mounted, but shifted their weapons, the subtle movement creating a sound like death itself taking a breath. "My son tells me you found him dying in the storm," Chief Red Sky said, his English precise and cold. "He tells me you gave him food and warmth." He stopped just outside arm's reach, close enough that Flint could see the intricate scars on the chief's chest, marks of countless battles won and enemies defeated. "Yes," Flint replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "He was freezing to death. I couldn't let a child die." Chief Red Sky studied him for a long moment. "He also tells me you gave him your only blanket. You knew the storm would last all night, yet you chose to sleep cold so that my son could live." Flint nodded. Any father would have done the same. "Perhaps," Chief Red Sky said. "Or perhaps you thought to keep him as a prize, to trade him back to us for safe passage through our lands." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Flint could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on him, warriors waiting for their chief's signal to turn this conversation into a massacre. "That's not true," Flint said. "I never wanted anything from you. I just couldn't watch a child suffer." "Then you are either very brave," Chief Red Sky said quietly, "or very foolish. Because what you have done has consequences that extend far beyond one night of kindness." Chief Red Sky raised his hand, and every warrior drew back their bowstrings in perfect unison. The sound of 100 arrows being knocked at once was like death itself taking aim. "You will prove your words," the chief said quietly, "or you will die where you stand." Flint's mind raced as he stared at 100 arrow points glinting in the morning light. How do you prove goodness to a man who's seen nothing but evil from your kind? Then inspiration struck like lightning. "Your son was wearing this when I found him," Flint said slowly, reaching into his pocket. Every warrior tensed, but he pulled out a small piece of torn fabric, part of the boy's buckskin shirt that had caught on a tree branch. "I kept it because I thought you might want proof that I didn't harm him." Chief Red Sky examined the fabric, recognition flickering in his eyes. It was indeed from his son's shirt, torn during his desperate flight through the forest. "He came to me more dead than alive," Flint continued, his voice growing stronger. "I could have driven him away, could have shot him as a trespasser. Instead, I carried him to my home. I gave him my food, my fire, my own blanket. I asked for nothing in return." The boy spoke up suddenly, tugging on his father's arm and pointing back toward the cabin. He ran to the door and beckoned for them to follow. Confused but curious, Chief Red Sky motioned for Flint to accompany them inside. In the cabin, the boy pointed to the spot by the fire where he'd slept, then to the empty bowl where Flint had served him broth. He mimed eating, then sleeping, then pointed to Flint and smiled. The first genuine smile Flint had seen from him, but Chief Red Sky's attention was focused on something else entirely. On the mantel sat Flint's most prized possession, a small daguerreotype of his own family. His wife and daughter, both killed in a cholera outbreak 2 years ago. The picture was worn from handling, surrounded by dried mountain flowers that Flint replaced every week. You have lost children, too, Chief Red Sky said quietly, and for the first time his voice held something other than anger. My little girl was about his age, Flint replied, his throat tight. Maybe that's why I couldn't turn him away. Chief Red Sky picked up the photograph, studying the faces of Flint's lost family. Outside, the warriors maintained their positions, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. The boy continued chattering in Apache, apparently telling his father every detail of how Flint had cared for him. He says you could have taken advantage, Chief Red Sky translated. A lone Apache child, the son of a chief. You could have demanded ransom, could have used him as protection. Instead, you simply warmed him and let him rest. Flint nodded. I've got no quarrel with your people, Chief. I just work my land and try to live in peace. Chief Red Sky was quiet for a long moment, still holding the photograph. When he finally spoke, his words surprised everyone, including his own son. My warriors expected to find a kidnapper this morning. They expected to burn this place to the ground and take your scalp back as proof of our justice. He set the photograph down carefully. Instead, we find a man who showed mercy to a child who could have been his enemy. Flint felt hope flickering in his chest, but he could also hear restless movement outside. 100 warriors had come here for blood, and their chief was talking about mercy. That kind of disappointment could quickly turn into a different kind of violence. But there is still a problem, Chief Red Sky continued, and Flint's hope crumbled. My warriors cannot return empty-handed. They cannot tell their wives and children that we rode out to punish a crime and came back with nothing but words. Flint's blood turned cold. What are you saying? I am saying that even though you meant no harm, you have created a situation that demands resolution. My people expected justice this morning, and if they don't get it... Chief Red Sky gestured toward the door where the sound of increasingly agitated voices could be heard. Some of my young warriors believe that any white man who touches an Apache child for any reason must pay the price. They think I am being weak by talking instead of fighting. Outside, someone shouted in Apache, and the sound was picked up by other voices. Flint couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were calling for blood. Chief Red Sky looked Flint directly in the eyes. There is only one way to satisfy both justice and honor this morning, but it will require something from you that may be harder than dying. A warrior named Broken Lance stepped directly into Chief Red Sky's path as they emerged from the cabin. His scarred face was twisted with rage, and he spoke rapidly in Apache, his voice rising with each word. Flint didn't need a translation to understand the challenge being thrown down. Chief Red Sky's response was quiet but firm, and Flint watched as the two men faced off. Chief against warrior, authority against grief-fueled anger. The careful discipline that had marked their arrival was starting to fracture, and Flint realized he was witnessing something that could split the tribe apart. Broken Lance pointed his war lance at Flint and shouted something that made several warriors nod in agreement. Chief Red Sky's jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of a final warning. But Broken Lance wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, close enough now that the point of his lance was almost touching Chief Red Sky's chest. The challenge was clear. Follow the old ways of blood for blood, or be seen as weak by the younger warriors. That's when the boy did something that no one expected. He stepped between the two men and began speaking in rapid, passionate Apache. His young voice cut through the tension like a knife, and Flint watched as Broken Lance's expression shifted from rage to confusion to something that might have been shame. Chief Red Sky translated quietly. He is telling them exactly what happened, how he got separated from the hunting party in the blizzard, how he wandered for hours without shelter, growing weaker with each step, how he expected to die alone in the snow until you found him. The boy continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each word. He pointed to Flint, then to himself, then mimed eating and sleeping. He was telling the story of his rescue, and even the warriors who had been supporting Broken Lance were listening. Now he is telling them about your family photograph, Chief Red Sky continued, about how he could see the sadness in your eyes when you looked at it. He is saying that you helped him because you understood loss, not because you wanted to use him against our people. Broken Lance lowered his lance slightly, but his face still showed doubt. He spoke again, this time directly to the boy, and Flint caught one word he recognized. Pindalikoyi, the Apache term for white man and not a friendly one. The boy's response was immediate and fierce. He stepped closer to Broken Lance and spoke with such intensity that several warriors actually stepped back. Whatever he was saying, it was having an impact. He is asking him if he has children. Chief Red Sky translated, surprise evident in his voice. He is asking him what he would want a stranger to do if his child was dying in a blizzard. Broken Lance's war lance dropped to his side. The boy wasn't finished. He continued speaking, his words now directed at all the warriors around them. Flint could see the effect rippling through the crowd as hard faces began to soften. He is telling them that punishing you for your kindness would make us no better than the soldiers who kill without asking questions first. He is saying that if we punish mercy, we become the monsters that the white man believes us to be. The silence that followed was deafening. 100 warriors sat motionless, processing the words of a 10-year-old boy who had just challenged their deepest beliefs about justice and revenge. Finally, Broken Lance spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Chief Red Sky's translation came slowly. He says that perhaps the spirit sent his war party a teacher instead of an enemy. He says that maybe wisdom sometimes comes from the smallest voices. Flint felt something shift in the air around them. The tension wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. Chief Red Sky looked at Flint with something that might have been respect. My son has just done something remarkable. He has turned a war party into a council meeting. But now comes the hardest part. What's that? Now you must prove to them that his faith in you was justified. Tonight, in our village, in front of the elders who have spent their entire lives fighting your people. Chief Red Sky gestured toward his horse. Are you ready to bet your life on the word of a child? Flint looked down at the boy, who was watching him with those same desperate eyes that had started this whole ordeal. But this time he realized the child wasn't begging for his help. He was offering his, and somehow that made all the difference. The ride to the Apache village took 4 hours through hidden canyons and secret paths that no white man had ever seen before. As they approached the camp, Flint could see dozens of fires flickering in the growing darkness and hear the low murmur of voices as word spread of their arrival. The tribal council convened immediately, and 9 elders sat in a circle around a central fire, their weathered faces grave in the dancing shadows. Flint stood in the center, acutely aware that he was probably the first white man to enter this sacred space and live to tell about it. Chief Red Sky spoke first, explaining the circumstances of his son's rescue. Then came Broken Lance, who, despite his earlier change of heart, still argued for traditional justice. The debate went back and forth in Apache for what felt like hours, with Flint understanding nothing except the occasional gesture in his direction. Finally, the boy stepped forward again. This time his voice was calm and measured, but his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. He spoke for nearly 15 minutes, never once looking away from the elders' faces. When he finished, the oldest member of the council, an ancient man whose hair was completely white, asked him a single question. The boy's answer was immediate and unwavering. Chief Red Sky turned to Flint. He asked him if he truly believes you would risk your life to save an Apache child again, knowing what it might cost you. He said yes, without hesitation. The elders conferred among themselves in whispers. Flint's heart pounded as he waited for their decision, knowing that these next few moments would determine whether he lived or died. The white-haired elder stood slowly, his joints creaking with age. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of decades of wisdom. He says, Chief Red Sky translated, that the spirits have sent us a test this morning, not a test of our ability to make war, but our ability to recognize when mercy deserves mercy in return. Flint felt his knees go weak with relief, but the elder wasn't finished. You will be granted safe passage back to your land, but more than that, you will be granted the protection of our tribe. Any Apache who harms you or your property will answer to this council. Flint could barely speak. I don't know what to say. There is one condition, the elder continued through Chief Red Sky's translation. You must promise that if any of our people come to you in need, hungry, wounded, or lost, you will show them the same kindness you showed this child. I promise, Flint said without hesitation. What happened next surprised everyone. The boy ran to Flint and hugged him tightly, speaking in broken English for the first time. Thank you for giving me blanket. Now I give you friendship. As the sun reached its peak, Flint rode back to his cabin with an escort of honor instead of a war party. The two cultures that had been on the brink of violence had instead found a bridge in the form of one cowboy's simple act of kindness. Flint's cabin became a neutral ground where Apache and settlers could meet safely. He never got rich, never became famous, but he lived the rest of his life knowing that sometimes the smallest acts of mercy can prevent the greatest tragedies. And every winter, when the mountain storms came howling through the passes, a young Apache man, no longer a shivering child but a respected warrior of his tribe, would visit Flint's cabin to share a meal and remember the moment when two worlds chose understanding over warfare. The boy who had once begged for warmth became a translator and peacekeeper between the tribes and settlers. Flint lived to be 68, dying peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by friends from both cultures who had learned that courage isn't always about fighting. Sometimes it's about knowing when to give your blanket to a freezing child instead. If you're loving these incredible true stories from the Old West, hit that subscribe button because we've got so many more tales of courage, conflict, and unexpected heroes waiting for you. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video.